So this panel, taking stock in the Arab uprisings, I think is going to be stellar. We've got a great group of experts here to talk about these different issues, and I think they're going to cover under this large topic very important and different issues, and we're very glad to be able to cover them. Our first panelist, and I'll introduce the three of them now, is Professor Nathan Brown. He is Professor of Political Science and International Affairs at George Washington University and a non-resident senior associate at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He served as a Carnegie Scholar and a fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center and is the author of 6 published books. He's going to be talking about election outcomes in the region and give us an overview of the many changes that have taken place in recent months. Our second panelist, Adel Iskandar, is a media and communication scholar who teaches in the Communication, Culture, and Technology program and at the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies at Georgetown University. He's the author and co-author of several works, including 2 forthcoming books on the Arab uprisings. He will be telling us about the evolution of Egyptian foreign policy, Egypt's role in the region after the elections in Egypt. Our third panelist, Professor Kristin Diwan, is an assistant professor in comparative and regional studies at American University. She's published on the politics and political economy of the Arab Gulf and is currently completing a manuscript on the emergence of Islamic banking in the GCC. She will be talking about the role of the Gulf countries and the GCC in shaping outcomes in the region. So I will turn it over at this point to Professor Brown, and I hope you'll join me in welcoming all 3 of our panelists. Thank you.
Thanks very much. What I want to sort of focus my remarks around is kind of the issue of elections in the Arab world, and in a sense, the meaning of the current moment of elections and electoral politics in the Arab world, because we seem to be entering, or the members of those societies in the Arab world, or at least some societies in the Arab world, are entering a new era in politics in which electoral outcomes are not known in advance. That's not true in every country in the region, but that is true in a couple very significant ones, and that is that elections are actually very old in the Arab world, going back in some countries to the 19th century. But the idea that you would have competitive elections in which, as I say, the electoral outcomes are not known in advance is new. So what I want to do is kind of first take a historical moment, sort of how did we get this way, to review kind of the history of elections in the Arab world. Second, take a look at the current moment, how it is changing, and the role that elections and electoral outcomes plays now in the Arab world. And then third, what I'd like to do is to, because this is a Palestine center, return it to the issue of how this will affect anything having to do with a Palestinian cause and Palestinian issue. So let me begin on that kind of historical note. As I say, elections go back to the 19th century in the Arab world. I think we're entering what might be considered, however, a fourth phase of elections. So let me talk about the first 3. Elections in the late 19th century into the early 20th century, and even mid-20th century in the Arab world, were essentially much less competitive affairs in which members of the society had some role in selecting which members of a small political elite would represent them. And this is not unusual in the history of elections elsewhere. It certainly was the origin of electoral, our federal election system was very much deliberately had some indirect elements in it. In the Arab world, this was done sometimes by having multi-stage elections. Suffrage would be widely distributed, but they would elect somebody who would then in turn elect somebody who might serve in a national parliament. There were sometimes literacy requirements for voting, which cut out an awful lot of the population. Interestingly enough, a literacy requirement was not included in Iraq during the mandate period when one was proposed, precisely in order to allow tribal leaders, many of whom were illiterate, to be elected. So the rules were deliberately engineered, in a sense, so that these were about not necessarily full participation from below, but about mediating within the political elite. That era basically began to give way to a second era about mid-20th century. It actually in which elections served a very different purpose, in which essentially they were ways of making the regime appear inevitable. And the first actual experiment with this that I know of, there may have been others, was actually again in mandatory Iraq, where when the British got the mandate for Iraq, they were expected by the League of Nations to show some sign that the mandate and the political system that they were implementing, which was a kingdom and Hashemite monarchy, had some kind of popular support. So they did something which they presented to the League of Nations as having held a referendum. What they actually did was to go around all of Iraq getting people to sign a loyalty oath to the king. And then they collected them, and surprisingly, everybody who signed it had signed it. So they presented that as an electoral outcome to the Arab world. You laugh, but that was essentially what elections were about in many countries for, actually in a few places still right up to the present. When elections were held, they were really about ratifying choices and kind of solidifying a regime, and not done in any particularly persuasive way either. What they were designed, it seems to me, to do was not to sort of fool the citizenry, because nobody was fooled, but again, to make the regime appear inevitable. A third phase actually occurred, I think, beginning in about the 1970s, so in some Arab countries, and spread to most but not all of them. And at that phase, elections became really about negotiating relationships between regime and opposition. With kind of one cardinal rule: the opposition lost. Okay, as long as you knew that the opposition was going to lose, everything else was negotiable. And so what I like to say about those elections, the rules were written on water, but the results were written in stone. A couple times, some people broke the rules. Algerians threatened to break the rules, and Palestinians threatened to break the rules, and found out the hard way what happens when you try to break that rule written in stone. For others, opposition was given a real voice. Opposition was given sometimes seats in parliament and important things that came with it, an ability to address their constituency, sometimes parliamentary immunity and that sort of thing. But electoral outcomes had no real impact over the holders of political authority or over determining the major directions of public policy. So that's what elections were about until very, very recently. Then in 2011, we suddenly get elections in which the results really matter and determine major policy directions and who's governing the country. How did this happen? That's kind of the second part of my talk. Well, it's a little bit puzzling in a sense, because if you think about it, these uprisings that the Arab world witnessed were not about elections. They were about people who'd given up on elections. If you take a look at sort of the revolutions that the Arab uprisings of 2011 are often compared to, that is the color revolutions of Eastern Europe, what is remarkable about one remarkable difference is that the color uprisings were generally oriented around elections. Electoral fraud, claimed electoral fraud, around a specific election campaign where the rules were kind of skewed against the opposition, but the opposition thought it might be able to use it as a way to push an opening. And that sort of thing. Tunisia had elections. Egyptians had elections. The people who were involved in these revolutions had given up on them, did not run in them, and as I say, had no faith in them. There's a partial exception we might hear from Kristin about, and that is what is happening right now in Kuwait, where the issue is really, in a sense, what sounds like an arcane dispute about how many votes an individual Kuwaiti voter gets. But it's really about an election, an electoral law, and an intense confrontation, but that's very much the exception. Okay, and that affected something about the nature, I think, of post-uprising politics, because what it meant was that when revolutions succeeded, those people who had organized and led them were not necessarily oriented immediately towards elections. They had pulled off impressive organizational feats, bringing down what looked to be very well entrenched authoritarian regimes, but they were not necessarily in a position, nor were many of them interested in turning around and turning that into electoral politics. And in fact, there were no real well-established rules about electoral politics, about who was going to vote, how they were going to vote, who was going to write what, and this sort of thing. These were countries that had to make things up from scratch. The Egyptians had to do it in a sense, and the Egyptian military kind of made many decisions for Egyptians. The Tunisians, the real interesting thing about it was To me, when just in a couple trips to Tunisia, whenever I would ask a question about why is it that you're doing things this way, the answer I would usually get was, well, back in the late 1950s when we got our independence, this is how we did it. Okay, so in essence, they had no real agreed upon set of rules, so they went by default, and they basically said, let's go back to independence and start over again and do it right. That's essentially was the Tunisian answer, and the Egyptian answer, in a sense, was no good answer, and they're still fighting over the basic rules by which political reconstitution will take place. And what I think that means is it tells you something about the role of elections right now in post-uprising countries. Because any attempt to move beyond kind of a revolutionary situation to sort of political reconstruction in this environment in which uprisings have taken place and in the 21st century will inevitably involve elections. And that means that, in a sense, the elections are inevitable, even if there's no real necessarily agreed upon set of rules, and in advance. And the results that we see, therefore, I think, should not surprise us. That we have those Islamist forces, often ones, especially in Egypt, but in some other places as well, that played this crooked game in the past, therefore being much better positioned, and also ones that were very, very good at discovering how to organize and mobilize constituencies. The problem, it seems to me, for the Arab world right now is that when you have meaningful and competitive elections, you have an imbalance. You have one fairly well organized and fairly capable set of political forces and no effective electoral counterweight to them. What is happening right now, and I'll leave a lot of the details on Egypt to Adel, who I think will follow me, is you have, it seems to me, really for the first time in a long time in a country like Egypt, a very decentralized or sort of dispersed or a pluralistic environment. That is to say, a country that was governed and dominated by one individual and by one institution, the presidency, really for half a century, suddenly has multiple centers of power. But the emerging leadership in the new presidency, Mohamed Morsi, I think has kind of gotten the message that they do have to reach understandings and they do have to reach out to other political forces. But the other political forces that they are most concerned about are those that are probably already within the Egyptian state. It is more important for them to reach an understanding with the military, with the security apparatus, with the judiciary, than it is for them to reach across to non-Islamist forces. When they are concerned with other forces on the society side, it's Salafi much more than it is with liberal non-Islamist forces of leftist forces, socialist forces, nationalist of various stripes, and that strikes me as, in a sense, an unhealthy situation. It's not about anybody's intentions. It's not about anybody's democratic credentials, but essentially a system in which the political competition that does take place is not a competitive multi-party environment, and that gives me some worry over the long term about the emergence about what kind of political systems can emerge from this. I think there's too much focus on what's in people's souls and hearts, and too little focus on essentially a set of structural conditions that are impeding the emergence of democracy. Let me turn then to my third topic. What does this mean for Palestine? Well, first, let me talk about the impact of the post-uprising environment on the Palestinian situation. In a sense, I think I will, sort of a bumper sticker answer would be a return to the 1960s. A return to the 1960s in the sense that you will have a great popular support for the Palestinian cause and very little action, at least for the short to medium term. The uprisings that have occurred in places like Egypt and Tunisia have really riveted the attention of these societies inward. These are very inward-looking moments in these places right now. And in those societies that have not undergone uprising, it's still a very inward looking focus. You take a look at Jordan right now. You take a look at Kuwait. That's really what the focus is about. So it is certainly the case that in an environment, in a post-uprising environment in some societies, and in what may be a pre-uprising environment in some others, there's all kinds of ways in which popular support for the Palestinian cause, I think, will be voiced. And the fact is that what is driving an awful lot of these uprisings is the sense that those people who hold political authority are completely unaccountable and are making decisions essentially in their own personal interest, and certainly not in any kind of conception of the common interest or the national interest. And their their ineffectiveness in international affairs is certainly part of, I think, their loss of legitimacy domestically, without question. So it certainly, in that sense, has contributed to an environment in which existing regimes have been toppled in some countries and pushed hard on others. But that does not translate into immediate action. And we've seen this, again, we'll probably hear more from Adel, but we've seen this most dramatically in the Egyptian case, where you have a leader from the largest civil society organization in the country, the Muslim Brotherhood, now serving as president with a very strong commitment to the Palestinian cause, hardwired into the Brotherhood since its origins, and a Palestinian policy that is different in nuance, but nuance only thus far from its predecessor. I'm not sure that's going to continue indefinitely, but it is going to continue, I think, for the short term. So the impact on Palestinian politics, which in what was already a frozen regional environment, is, I think, to freeze things still more deeply. What about the impact inside Palestinian politics? This is a question I get asked kind of all the time. Why was there no uprising, or is there a prospect for a popular uprising in the West Bank and Gaza? And or the questions that sometimes asked that I asked, well, what's the prospect of Palestinian elections shaking things up? And my sense there is that it is impossible to hold. I mean, a basic mistake was made in 2006, both by Palestinians and by the international community. A really fundamental mistake, which Palestinians are still paying the price for. In 2006, Hamas was elected. There was an intense international effort and a domestic effort to make sure that they would not enjoy the fruits of that power. And I mean, this should not be a surprise to people. What all those people who participated in that effort forgot, or we were too impatient to realize, was that in 2010, Hamas would have to face Palestinian voters again. Now it's not clear if they'll have to do so in the current leader's lifetime. The Palestinian political system and the electoral system, which was probably the most developed in the Arab world at that time, was shattered. That's using the passive voice. People shattered it. People broke it on purpose. And Palestinians are paying the price for it today. Palestinian elections will not be possible in any kind of unifying sense until the Palestinian leadership comes together. And what that means essentially is a divided Palestinian Authority, the two halves of which in the two major national movements essentially have to cut a deal before you can have elections. So rather than having elections determining who holds power, those who hold power will determine elections. And that's a return essentially to the Arab past, which is not good news. What about movement outside of those movements? In my mind, and I'm talking as an analyst, not as an advocate. I live in suburban Virginia and will not participate in any Palestinian uprising, whether I support it or not. But my sense is that is the only path forward for Palestinians, some kind of popular mobilization that puts real pressure on those leaders. And why hasn't that happened? Well, it was tried. And it was tried fairly seriously about a year and a half ago, and actually got some traction. And what it forced the Palestinian leadership to do on both sides, on Hamas and Fatah's part, was to agree to national unity. And as soon as they came to that agreement, they told those people who were leading this popular campaign that politics was now back in the hands of adults and they could leave the room and go home. And that's essentially what happened. The problem for Palestinians right now, it seems to me, is almost the exact opposite of the ones that faced Egyptians and Tunisians during the uprising. Egyptians and Tunisians during the uprisings had no real political forces in which to speak for them. The political field was dominated by these big regimes that just sat there and completely controlled the system. Palestinians are, in a sense, the Palestinian political space, unlike the Egyptian and the Tunisian space, is not empty. Hamas is a very real organization, and Fatah, for all of its problems, still exists and occupy the political field. So the moment you have popular mobilization, they're not entering an uncrowded, like an empty Tahrir Square where every voice can be heard, but instead they are entering a very into an environment in which political leaders are very well practiced in at least manipulating politics in their terms of their own short-term agenda. Some breakage of that monopoly probably has to take place in both the West Bank and Gaza, and the existence of essentially authoritarian regimes in both places, I think that makes it very, very difficult, and conditions of occupation obviously make it more difficult still. But if there's any path forward for the Palestinians, and again, I want to make clear, I'm saying this as an analyst, not as an advocate. It seems to me that for Palestinians to become, again, actors within their own politics, it will be dependent on ordinary Palestinian citizens re-entering and forcing their way and forcing their agenda on their leaders and forcing the attention of regional and international leaders to them. Will that take place? Someday I think it will. I don't know if it's going to happen anytime soon. And here I will just say as an advocate rather than as an analyst, I just hope that when that happens, not too many people get hurt. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much, Nathan. I'm going to piggyback on a lot of the points that you made. Thank you for bringing up various issues pertaining to the Egyptian polity and what's happening there. I just want to say that even though most of my commentary and remarks are going to be contained under the rubric of a discussion on the Egyptian foreign policy, at the same time, I think the Egyptian foreign policy translates into a lot of regional parameters, a lot of impact outside of Egyptian national boundaries, and has, of course, a significant role to play as far as the U.S. Government's role to play within the region at large. I'm actually at the point now of complete perplexion as far as the Egyptian foreign policy. And I think that most of us are probably in the same position. So when I was asked to talk about Egypt's evolving foreign policy, it's like, well, is evolving really the right word? Is it evolving? Is it devolving? Or is it just revolving? Sorry, silly play on words, but really, it cuts to the issue of, where is the Egyptian foreign policy going? But there's one thing that has to be said, and that's the fact that for the very fact that we are discussing the Egyptian foreign policy implies that something that was the status quo for the past 30 years under the Mubarak's NDP has shifted in some way, shape, or form, at least rhetorically speaking. So I want to talk a little bit about two levels. One is a rhetorical shift in foreign policy and a substantive shift in foreign policy, and whether the two actually cohere in some functional way. Now, of course, as Nathan explained, there has been, or there appears to be, a significant geostrategic shift in the region at large. And of course, it's very difficult for us to be able to gauge what this means. We can look at elections as a barometer of the increasing interest in political engagement, as well as its ability to translate into functional elections that might be considered transparent, or more so than any other exercise previously. So all of that is quite interesting. But I would actually argue that the geostrategic map has not been redrawn. And actually quite the contrary, that what ended up happening was that all of the different players, the masterminds, if you will, that were part and parcel of the development of regional and domestic policies in the region have come to the fore. So now we can begin to see the fault lines between the different camps and how that translates. And given the fact that we're not really talking about Syria on this panel, I'm just going to interject by saying that Syria is a critical example of precisely that. So when you pick up literally both the state media and the independent press of various countries in the Arab world, you can see how the landscape and the contours of politics actually look. And arguably, it is no different than what it was about 5 to 10 years ago, but with slightly more sort of manifest destiny associated with it. So I think that there have been some shifts, but I don't think it is a cataclysmic shift. It's not that the chairs have been knocked off entirely, but people have switched roles, and people sitting on chairs are slightly different. Which brings me to a discussion of the Muslim Brotherhood. Now, not a seamless connection, but I think to a large extent we understand and we process the Muslim Brotherhood as a political entity on a variety of different levels. Nathan mentioned their civil society role, their impact on a domestic level, but they're also quite a significant player and quite a powerful player, regionally speaking and internationally. They have both a coherent dogma, they have a sophisticated ideological system, and they have an institutionalized political order that they can utilize and turn to and deploy when they see fit to be able to translate into institution building, or at least institutional reform. So when the Muslim Brotherhood assumed the role of authority in Egypt, initially in a very, very sort of defanged way through the parliamentary elections, which later, of course, the parliament was disbanded, but in a more functional and visible way in Morsi's presidency, we begin to see the Muslim Brotherhood for the first time actually test out a lot of their sort of rhetorical discussions to see if they translate well on the ground. Arguably, they don't translate well. They don't translate well on a variety of different levels because in the larger sort of arithmetic of international and regional politics, being sort of adamant and having sort of a contiguous, coherent political position can sometimes put you in trouble when you're dealing with competing parties. So there's no shortage of examples of this. Since Morsi's assumption to the presidency, there's been the slight, tiff among friends, if you will. Of course, Morsi doesn't really acknowledge that, between the United States and Egypt, where President Obama said, we're not really sure if we're friends with Egypt or this is a friendly relationship or not. Morsi, of course, gave an interview to Charlie Rose when he was in New York, and he reiterated the same sort of position, said, we're friends, but we're not allies, sort of identifying a clear distinction. The Arabic translation is a little bit more interesting. He's like, أصدقاء ولسنا حلفاء. So we're friends but not allies. And so Charlie Rose tried to push him, or what do you mean by allies? Are you working together in a concerted effort as far as policy is concerned? And Morsi didn't really want to delve into that too much so as to not create rifts beyond what was already stated. So that was one problem. Another major sort of public image quagmire that the Muslim Brotherhood tends to face quite often is the fact that they have that there is a Ministry of Foreign Affairs. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs, extremely different, both in terms of its sensibilities, its institutionalization, and its morale, if you will, from the Muslim Brotherhood, and is very impenetrable, if you will, to the Muslim Brotherhood ideals. So how does that translate as far as Egypt's face abroad? So when it comes to basic things like protocol, the relationship between Egypt and Israel, you might recall that there was that basic letter of credence sent from the Egyptian President Mohamed Morsi to Benjamin Netanyahu, appointing a new ambassador, spoke in very colorful terms about the relationship between Egypt and Israel. The Muslim Brotherhood initially came out and said that this letter was never sent, that it was a fabrication, and then came back and said, well, actually it's protocol, and it was released, and it came out of the... Well, did the president sign it? Initially, no, but actually, yes. And so the shift in public discourse surrounding the actions of the Muslim Brotherhood in its international sort of dynamics has come back to hurt the Muslim Brotherhood quite significantly, because all of a sudden they don't seem as coherent in their public message as they have always appeared to be. Now, of course, as a pragmatic organization, the Muslim Brotherhood over the 18 months of SCAF's rule have also been quite opportunistic and very pragmatic and very realist in their state of affairs, which has meant that in many instances they've spoken out of two sides of their mouths, which is, the way politics is supposed to operate. So the question is, I mean, what is, do we judge the Muslim Brotherhood based on their ability to craftily design a foreign policy that meets the Egyptian national interests in this current moment, or do we judge them based on the fairly strict rhetorical parameters that are consistent with their own sort of organizational structure and organizational philosophy? I don't think there's an answer to this, but what I can say is that the United States needs a partner and has always needed a partner. We hear that often in the case of the Palestinian-Israeli standoff, but the same applies in Egypt. The American administration and administrations to follow will always need Egypt to be both coherent and an active participant in a relationship that is extremely strategic. I would argue that Egypt is not only strategic now as it was before, it's perhaps even more of an important strategic partner for reasons that I'll explain momentarily. But the key for the U.S. government is to ensure that U.S. interests in the region are sustained and maintained, and that nothing really threatens those. Unless, of course, the American foreign policy in the region is redrawn. I don't see sort of glowing indications of this happening, but nevertheless, I think the Muslim Brotherhood and Mohammed Morsi, both in private and in a very subtle way in public, have essentially reaffirmed and confirmed to the American government that the key issues will not be touched, that things will not change. And we hear that from a variety of different sources, whether it's Jimmy Carter after conversations with Mohammed Morsi, or the foreign ministry articulating it in subtle terms as well. But identity politics is really where it's at right now. The Egyptian political scene, often perceived as extremely homogeneous, completely coherent, that Egyptians are one and the same, is falling apart. And this is something that any future government in Egypt, including the Muslim Brotherhood now, will struggle to try and create some meaningful logic out of. In fact, as we speak now, there's a protest in Tahrir Square in support of Sharia's imposition in the constitution, which is currently in draft form. And from the little news that I'm getting, it appears as though the protest is quite sizable. So this is a show of force on the part of the Salafis and various other groups right of the Salafis, if one could imagine such a thing existing. But the Muslim Brotherhood have basically disowned this particular protest, which of course is an indication that they're prepared to play politics across the spectrum. But this is a force to be reckoned with. That there is there is political expression that re-articulates Egyptian identity as an Islamist identity, and is quite forceful in its rhetoric, and is prepared to deploy in the streets and bring out significant numbers. This is not a negligible point. In addition to that, the Egyptian foreign policy is defined not just by the identity politics, but also defined by the constitutional turmoil currently unfolding in Egypt. The U.S. government, as well as various governments in the region, would like to see Egypt take sort of a step forward in the terms of the design of a constitution that represents the plurality of Egyptian society. Now that we've shattered the view that Egypt is a homogeneous nation, knowing that there are Copts and Baha'is and Shias and Sufiyin and Nubians and Sinai Bedouins and Amazigh, etc., in Egyptian society, that all of them have to be part and parcel of the design of the constitution. So there is some degree of rhetorical pressure from the world at large to ensure that the Egyptian constitution is representative so that it can become a model. Arguably, the result is not of that kind, or is not of that ilk, and that serves a particular problem. There's also the significant fragmentation of the political scene at large. For any foreign policy to be functional, there needs to be some sort of unified vision for the country, and this is quite absent in Egyptian society right now. Fragmentation really undermines the outreach of the Egyptian government. In addition to that, there's also the media component. In the aftermath of the toppling of Mubarak, 16 new satellite stations were registered and ratified, as well as tens, if not hundreds, of newspapers that are almost impossible to keep track of. Many of which have actually taken a fairly strong stance in opposition to both the Muslim Brotherhood and the Islamists at large, and that, of course, creates a disequilibrium that will translate into fairly non-contiguous sort of disconcerted effort on the part of the Egyptian Foreign Ministry to communicate Egypt's sort of goals and what they're trying to accomplish. In addition to that, we also have the fragmentation of the non-Islamist front. Liberal parties are not playing a particularly significant role, and really arguably the most problematic thing about the Egyptian political scene right now, as far as foreign policy is concerned, is the issue of blame. There's a blame game being passed around. So if a member of the Muslim Brotherhood or even a low-level official in the Egyptian bureaucracy were to meet with an American official and there were to be news about this, automatically it would translate into criticism of this state of affairs, and the opposite is true. So NGO laws or civil society organizations receiving even the most minuscule of funding from either the U.S. government or U.S. sort of subcontractors, that of course translates into hefty criticism in the Egyptian polity. So the Egyptian political scene rhetorically is very much opposed to sort of strong relations with the United States, and yet nevertheless the Muslim Brotherhood and Mohammed Morsi need to continue sustaining this relationship almost against their own sort of personal will. I don't know what their personal will is. I should take that back. But that's there's something sort of inconsistent with the ideals of the Muslim Brotherhood, as Nathan seemed to suggest. The other problem with Egyptian foreign policy is the issue of reciprocal altruism. The Egyptian government needs to scratch the back of another country and have their back scratched by others. And I find that this is probably the most complicated scenario right now. There's a tremendous amount of concern about the impact of the Muslim Brotherhood regionally. There are other countries who see the organization as a major nuisance in their domestic state of affairs, and that any organization that resembles them or seeks or has inspiration from the Muslim Brotherhood needs to be quieted or silenced. And so all of a sudden, I think the current Egyptian government has a re-articulated notion of regional power. And I'm going to give a few quick points on this issue of Egypt's regional power. First of all, Egypt is trying as best it can to play the role of an intermediary and a broker on many different levels, but predominantly in the standoff in Syria between Bashar al-Assad's regime and the Syrian opposition. Very few results have actually come out of this brokerage, but nevertheless it still exists, and it's an attempt for Egypt to basically flaunt its power in the region at large, and perhaps to play a counterpoint to the growing influence of Turkey in the region, and of course Qatar. So Egypt needs to sort of reassert its perennial role as a parental figure in the eyes of the region at large, and that doesn't seem to be working particularly well. And of course, reaching out to Iran. We've heard a lot of news about Morsi's visit to Iran. I would argue that this is both reaching out and not reaching out to Iran, that it was sort of both a double-edged sword for the Iranians and for the Egyptians, but it was a sign that we're prepared to engage in diplomatic communication, but this diplomatic communication will remain very much within the structure and the parameters that we define. It seems as though it's a zero-sum game as far as Egyptian regional power is concerned. The Saudis, of course, must play a role to try and appease the current the Muslim Brotherhood, because their rhetoric, if not subdued, could become quite problematic, especially in the Gulf, an area that is staunchly monarchical and not particularly conducive to the kind of sort of change that the Muslim Brotherhood advocates on a regional level. The reach and input of the new authority in Egypt, I think, is is quite important. That the Muslim Brotherhood is very much a regional and international entity, and this is something that we cannot forget. Even though they have a role to play within the Egyptian polity, but their inspiration spans across the region. We know that about the Nahda. We understand the relationship with Hamas and other locales across the region. Not to mention Kuwait and elsewhere. So the Muslim Brotherhood do have that sort of pan-Arab element to them, which of course can be used to exert Egyptian foreign policy in the region, but so far it's been contained largely because of a fear that the region at large may not be receptive to it, or perhaps that that the Muslim Brotherhood's performance in Egypt might be more less conducive to emulation, if you will, that it doesn't look like it's going particularly well for the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, so why follow in their footsteps? So there's that component. And then, of course, the decision on the part of the Egyptian government as to whether or not to shift from soft power to hard power. Traditionally, Egypt has been sort of an influential country culturally in the region, with declining influence over the past 15, 20 years. But now there's a new sort of instrument, a new tool at the hands of the soft power institutions, and that's basically Islamist politics. It's something that can be used. There's also an increased military dormancy over the past 30 years. Egypt has a functional military and quite a sophisticated one at that, but still very much contained. And now we start seeing the first level of engagement, military engagement in Egypt in the Sinai Peninsula, but it doesn't seem to be going particularly well either. So that's not something to flaunt. So what's really left? I think at the end of the day, the Muslim Brotherhood can turn to their comfortable spot, which is an Islamist Pax Egyptiana, if you will, if I can say so. It's to basically try and utilize what they find to be the most convincing rhetorical tool that can cross Egyptian national boundaries, but also bring people to the polls on a fairly regular and sustained basis, and then hope that in the long term that they can create some degree of identitarian coherency inside the Egyptian polity that can eventually translate into a meaningful and sustained foreign policy. What does this mean for Palestine? Now, Nathan really covered this in a spectacular way, so I'm not going to try and reiterate it. But just to keep in mind that the Egyptian political, entity that rules right now, both in terms of the Muslim Brotherhood and the institutions that are at its whim to a large extent, are taking actions that would otherwise be considered completely inconsistent with their own ideals. In the next 24 to 48 hours, according to a recent statement from the Ministry of Defense in Egypt, they will be going after the Gaza tunnels. Or not just Gaza tunnels, but along Sinai. They're going to be going after the Gaza tunnels and hopefully, whatever, for them, shutting down all the tunnels. The fact that they will, strike with an iron fist, it's called Operation Eagle, in the part of making sure to subdue the Sinai situation, and that they continue to give, assurances to both the United States and Israel in almost every respect, as far as highly sort of protected terrain for the Camp David Accords, with very limited, opportunities for redrafting or amendment. In fact, the Egyptian Foreign Ministry about 3 months ago had come out and said that any readaptation or any amendment to the Camp David Accord, even when it pertains to cultural exchange or trade agreements, will have to come with the agreement of the Israelis first. So this is an Egyptian government that is prepared to forego its own sort of, influence in the region at the expense of everything else. Thank you very much.
I want to thank the Palestine Center for inviting me. It's really such a pleasure to be here. I haven't gone down here in a while, and I used to love to come down here as a student, so it's nice to come here in a different capacity as well. I've been asked to talk about the GCC states, or the Arab Gulf, and their role in the Arab Spring, this kind of post-Arab Spring era. And I'm going to be a bit contrarian and not start where most people start when they talk about Gulf influence, and that is I'm not going to start by talking about money. And there's definitely no question that a lot of the growing confidence that the Gulf has had in the past decade, in particular during this last oil boom, period of elevated oil prices, has come from the growth of this wealth that they've had, and the ability for them to use this wealth to really, I think, gel their identity as this particular subregion within the Arab world, and the confidence then to project that across the region. And I think that's really noticeable to anyone here, whether in media, definitely, also growingly in entertainment and through social networks and all of these sorts of things. There's also no question that the wealth of the Gulf has found its way through to influence other Arab states, even before the Arab Spring, through foreign investment and through, I guess, what Greg Gause usually used to speak about as realpolitik, direct aid to governments, which is something that we do kind of need to address and look at in this period. But I want to kind of look, instead of looking at that in particular, I want to take the influence of this wealth in a different direction. And that is the way that this wealth then provided all of these labor opportunities for people all around the Arab region to come and work into the Gulf. And I think if the audience here is, I see a lot of like Palestinians, maybe Syrians, Egyptians here. You probably know this because almost everyone here probably has some family member who has gone to work in the Gulf. And this has really been accentuated in the last decade, but obviously it's been going on for quite some time. And I want to stress that because what that means is that we've had this real flow of both money going out, but also of people coming into the Gulf for a very long time. And what this has done, I think, has created a surprising sort of richness in some ways. It's a kind of subterranean richness in a lot of the political thinking, particularly within the Islamic fields in the Gulf. We've had all sorts of kind of hybrid kinds of thinking emerge from this, from Muslim Brotherhood activists who came to the Gulf and then mixed with and had to wrestle with kind of Wahhabi tenets and with Salafi actors that they found there. And across the Gulf region, Kuwait has also been a pivotal actor. So that we see a lot of different hybrid kind of groupings in the Gulf right now. And so when I look at the Gulf political field, and particularly its Islamic elements, this Islamic political field, what we see is this incredible diversity. I mean, we have definitely a trend of sort of loyalist Salafis, kind of in the old Saudi model, but we also have a ton of different sort of Salafi iconoclasts that are present throughout the Gulf, along with sort of Salafi jihadis, which are still present. Muslim Brotherhood obviously has a really big role in the region. But you also have the same sort of divisions that you see in Egypt. When we talk about the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, a lot of frustration of younger people and of youth, or even, youth gets kind of stretched in this context up to people in their 30s and that sort of thing, which I like. But we have the same sort of splits in Gulf Muslim Brotherhood movements that we see in Egypt. A lot of frustration with youth, with the hierarchy of the Muslim Brotherhood, with the rigidity of it, and a greater receptivity kind of in this Gulf environment with a lot of people coming and going to thinking beyond sort of just a narrow Islamic state and to try to think of a more open system that would allow for a more civil state that would incorporate different kinds of elements of the public so that Islamists wouldn't exactly dominate. And all of those are really present, and I think we don't always see them because of the political structures of the Gulf. In some states you can kind of see them, but the kind of ability for them to express themselves in organizational forms that we would recognize, and definitely to express themselves in terms of the political orientation of these states does not always come through. But I think, especially I was thinking about Adel in your speech when you were talking about the importance of this new Islamic political field. I mean, a lot of that is being generated in the Gulf, and that's really where I want to place most of my remarks, is thinking about that sphere and how the Gulf has the ability to influence that growing transnational sphere, which I think has really been empowered in this Arab Spring, when we're not just talking about state governments anymore. We're talking about populist politics that really have a chance to make a mark on the region. I'm going to do this, though, in a more traditional way, I guess, which is to look at it as it gets expressed in different state actors then, because the states obviously do have a really big role. And I think what we can see is when we look at state actors, the Gulf actors playing a role throughout the region, we do see two states that kind of stand out, obviously, and that are displaying, I would argue, sort of different visions towards the Arab Spring, and that is, of course, Saudi Arabia and Qatar. And but I think it's important to note that these states also have to deal with this Islamic field, and that they're drawing the expression from within what is taking place on the ground, and sometimes fighting against it. So what I want to do then, in doing this, I may sort of simplify a bit the postures of these two states in a way that's a bit unfair. But I think I do believe that they have two distinct orientations, and so I'm going to do it in a way that at least sharply brings out what those two orientations are, and see what their different orientations, what their different appeals, and what their real strategies are in this new regional environment. So let me start with Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is a status quo power. And I think what's interesting in this period is that, we're living in a sort of revolutionary order. And so what does a status quo power do when you have tremendous change going on all around them? And I think, what we've seen is Saudi Arabia becoming a lot more active and a lot more aggressive in expressing their position within the region, and in determining, trying to really use their influence to determine outcomes. And I think that can be understood because status quo powers can't sit and accept the status quo anymore when a lot is going. They have to become active to then change things. And when we look at and we try to understand their regional activism, we can definitely highlight a couple of things. One is definitely the essential political conservatism of Saudi Arabia, and I mean this in a couple of ways, but most predominantly in the conservatism of a monarchy, which obviously is not very receptive to revolutionary type politics of any kind. And we really saw this in Saudi Arabia's reactions, rather quick reaction in the Arab Spring, in looking to defend not only itself, but to defend all other monarchical orders in the region. And it was really fascinating to see Saudi Arabia taking the lead and kind of pressing for an expansion of the Gulf Cooperation Council to extend to Jordan and even Morocco, which I had no idea that Morocco was anywhere near the Gulf. And I actually, when I first read this news, I actually thought it was satire, but it wasn't. So there you go. And I think that really strikes to the concern that Saudi Arabia had in this new order, and their desire for more control, and to make sure that these orders would be safe and that we wouldn't see any monarchies falling in this period. The second strong element of that, of course, was the decisive Saudi intervention in Bahrain, when Bahrain was the first state in the Gulf to really draw upon this new spirit that was coming, and very soon after, the timing of their first protest, the February 14th protest, came very soon after the successful movement in Egypt and bringing down Hosni Mubarak. And I think that was really a scary time for a lot of the monarchs in the Gulf. And Saudi Arabia was quite determined and acted very decisively in organizing this Peninsula Shield Force, and then directly intervening under this force, which was mostly Saudi National Guard troops, to not allow anything to go further in Bahrain. And it is interesting to note that, it didn't have a huge amount of potential for success, but there were negotiations going on with the main opposition and with elements of the monarchy at that time, and I think being somewhat supported by the United States. So there was some kind of move towards maybe allowing for some reform in Bahrain that would have maybe given a different tenor to where things would be going in the Gulf. And Saudi Arabia clearly was not happy with that and acted very decisively. The second element, of course, of the Saudi intervention in Bahrain speaks to my second posture of Saudi Arabia in the region, and that is obviously the strong eye that Saudi Arabia has on Iran, and their concern always for how Iran will come out in this new environment, and wanting to make sure that Saudi Arabia is in a better posture than Iran is, and to take advantage, in fact, of Iran when they can in these different battles. And Bahrain was really a red line in that, because the Saudis, not only in looking at the position of Iran, also I think in looking at Iran, it's important to note for all of the states in the Gulf and even around the region, the pivotal role that the American intervention in Iraq played in that, the discomfort that a lot of the monarchies and Sunnis in the Gulf felt with the empowerment of Shia in that country, and the distrust that they had for that, and what that might mean for an empowerment of Iran. And they were definitely very keen to not allow any sort of experiment like that happening in Bahrain, which, of course, if there were some democratic empowerment, would have been to the benefit of the Shia majority in that country. So I think when you put these two things together, that Saudi's trying to do, I mean, the one perhaps puzzle or the interesting thing in this has been the Saudi kind of role in turning towards Syria. And I think this is really key. Because I think in Syria Saudi found a way to kind of get out of some of the difficulties. Because Saudi Arabia was taking an anti-revolutionary stance in here that was clear in Egypt. But they didn't want to stand on a popular level, to be seen as sort of some counter-revolutionary power in this period. And I think Syria, and championing sort of what was happening in Syria on some level, allowed Saudi Arabia to both take part in the Arab Spring, but to subtly change its message. And instead of then having at least some elements of the Arab Spring, where people were coming out of Egypt and Tunisia, of these sort of citizen revolts and of a transformation of the domestic order in a way that at least we had hoped at one point might be a little bit more inclusive of different elements. What you really saw, I think, for Saudi Arabia looking towards Syria was a chance to kind of position then more of a Sunni freedom campaign, and to put a distinctive sort of Sunni element to the kind of liberation struggle that was happening there. And that's been very useful both in mobilizing the public, and the Gulf public is very mobilized on the Syrian issue, again, against Iran, and inoculating the public from any sort of appeals that might come from that angle. And also in turning then any sort of threat that Saudi Arabia may have felt from its own public, because the whole kind of nature of the struggle had changed. Let me turn a little bit to Qatar then. And Qatar is even more perplexing because it is quite surprising to see this small state play this very vigorous role. And I heard it described once in trying to explain what Qatar is doing is that it's nothing more than a vanity project of two men. I think that may have been Greg Gauss as well. And if it was Greg Gauss, it makes sense because it's almost impossible to understand what Qatar is doing from a power politic perspective. I mean, it doesn't make sense that Qatar is playing this kind of role. And of course, we can look at Qatar and think of it more in its role of trying to project more soft power in the region. But I want to say that it's more than even that. I mean, obviously, Qatar has had this long role with Al Jazeera that has been able to project it into regional politics quite a lot. But I would say that still, Qatar wouldn't have the influence that it has in this period if it weren't championing a certain position. And I think what Qatar has been doing is trying to position themselves to champion what is, after all, a very popular position. I mean, I think they've been taking positions that where they get a lot of receptivity amongst broader Arab publics. And I think a lot of the Arab public right now is kind of in favor of these dramatic changes. They're also oriented a little bit towards towards the Islamists, probably centered more in Muslim Brotherhood politics, but maybe a little bit more expansive than that. And I think a lot of Qatar's kind of soft power emerges from actually championing these positions that get a lot of popular appeal. And that then looks a little bit different than Saudi Arabia. And I think I want to highlight one other thing that Qatar has really done, partially in creating this space. So we all know that Al Jazeera has played a really big role in allowing a lot of these different kinds of points of views to come and cohere and to have discussions. But another thing that Qatar is doing that I've become very aware of, and talking myself to a lot of youth across the Gulf, and trying to understand where they're getting their political positions and what's intellectually challenging them, is how much the role of these sort of public intellectuals that Qatar has championed has been playing in the formation of opinion throughout these areas. And Qatar has been doing this with a lot of different people. And I think actually this battle of ideas is really important. And I think it's played a role in gelling much more of this sort of Islamist position. And also a lot of the different thinkers there are people that are kind of closer to the Muslim Brotherhood, but maybe taken a step away from them. And this has had a lot of influence, I think, with a lot of young activists. It also gives Qatar another way to come at kind of the Iran issue. I mean, I think Qatar is not quite as concerned with it as Saudi Arabia is, but I think in their policies, by basically presenting an alternative to the old politics of kind of the resistance front, by championing those sorts of issues, by the Emir of Qatar going to Gaza, for instance, then they are able to kind of take the public, any sort of public, and inoculate the public from anything that Iran might try to throw at this time, which is also important. And that allows for a certain sort of confluence between the positions that Saudi Arabia and Qatar are taking. So that I think if we look at the different conflicts, there's some places where they definitely disagree and where their positions are. Egypt would probably be one of those, although it might be a little bit less now. And but in Syria, they may be able to find some common grounding in what they want to achieve. One just quick note, I don't have much time to talk about it, but a lot of these ideas as they're projected abroad also are playing out, like I said, in the Gulf itself. And I think it's worthwhile to kind of step back from some of the initial assumptions that the Gulf monarchies were sort of immune from the Arab Spring. That was already not true if you look at the tremendous unrest that happened in Bahrain and the outcome of that. But we can see, I mean, I definitely see it in the research and the studies that I do, that a lot of this conversation and a lot of this desire for reform and a lot of the push for finding a common stance that will allow for the kind of reform that would really hold Gulf monarchies much more accountable is definitely still there. And Kuwait is definitely the place to watch for that right now. They've had just tremendous protests in the past year. More recently, it's even been escalating much more. You've had perhaps over 100,000 people in the street. This is a wealthy Gulf country. People have a lot to lose in that state. And it's quite tremendous to see how people are willing to mobilize and go out in the street, pushing essentially for more power for the parliament versus the monarchy. And I think what's been fascinating me too is to see how all of the different Gulf states, and even beyond the Gulf, are really watching that. And Kuwait is always kind of a very insular political culture, but right now everybody is really paying attention because everyone knows that if they do manage to hold a certain coalition and force this kind of change, it really will be something that will be noteworthy throughout the Gulf. So, thank you.
Before we move into Q&A, I wanted to present a question to the panel, which interestingly ties in all of the different topics that were covered. Nathan talked about the sort of general trends in the region. Adel talked about the evolution or revolution of Egyptian foreign policy, and Kristin, of course, covered the Gulf. And these three areas intersected, as you mentioned, in Gaza recently, when you had the Emir of Qatar, before visiting, announced sending an ambassador to Gaza to oversee a significant development project. After his visit, I should say during his visit, Adel, he made sure to mention during much pomp and circumstance that he would not be there if not for Al-Akh Hamad Mursi. And this, of course, is something that I think we can all agree would not have happened had the changes in the region not occurred, given the kind of role the Mubarak regime was playing. And where I would like you to kind of take this is a little bit further, and you all touched on it a little bit, but how do the different actors that you talked about, how has what has changed in the region affect the way that they're going to be involved in the domestic Palestinian question? Because people looking at what has been going on in Gaza from Ramallah are probably a little bit concerned right now. And so I would ask you to elaborate from your different points of view about how those actors are involved in Palestinian domestic politics. Whoever wants to jump in and start can go ahead.
I'll start with just a couple observations. Number one, it's clear that the policy of isolating Hamas in Gaza has just plain failed. Okay, but that's not to say that Gaza is top on anybody's priority list, or that internal Palestinian politics is top on anybody's priority list. I don't think that's necessarily the case. My own sense is that the short-term effect in terms of Palestinian politics will be essentially just to entrench the two actors even internally, even more deeply for now, but it should send a message to all external actors that they should use this current respite very, very well, and they're not. That this is, the Palestinian Authority in Ramallah is in a sense living on borrowed time and borrowed money. The government in Gaza is not going to be avoidable indefinitely. So this is a time to sort of step back. There's nothing actually pressing this issue immediately on anybody's agenda, and think about a way to approach this issue before it comes up and bites you.
And I can just add one quick statement. I mean, I think Nathan captured. Oh, sorry. I thought mine was doing all the distortion. Hello? Oh. Okay. So I think the only major shift is the fact that, Hamas as a political player in the Palestinian landscape will have to become normalized on the international scene with major players like Saudi Arabia and Egypt, basically flanking Hamas as a political organization and raising its public profile. Of course, both the government of Qatar and Al Jazeera as a network have basically had effectively created a platform for Hamas for an extended period of time, at least the last 5 to 10 years. But now I think it's become far more instrumental and is translating into a greater sort of institutionalization of Hamas as an organization that can speak to the aspirations of Palestinians outside of Gaza. So I think to a large extent it's about the international political scene's perception of Hamas as a political player and as a potential representative government, given the changing landscape. I don't know if that necessarily is seen as an advantageous scenario for all the political actors in the region at large. I mean, the Qataris, I think it's basically been their bread and butter for quite some time, and they're happy to see a political interlocutor that is firmly in their front, if you will, take that step forward. But for the Saudis, I think it's slightly more problematic. So I'm extremely interested in how the dynamics between the Qataris and the Saudis will translate as far as their perception of the representative, if you will, of the Palestinians on the international political scene. That is yet to translate into sort of material action. But as far as the Egyptians are concerned, when the representatives of Hamas came to visit Cairo, all the roads leading from the airport to the presidential palace were lined with Muslim Brotherhood activists carrying sort of flags and signs of both the Muslim Brotherhood and Hamas. So it was a glorious ceremonial moment for Hamas to be received in Cairo, not as sort of the tertiary organization that they were under the Mubarak era, but rather as the representatives of Palestinian emancipation.
Kristin, before you tell us about the Gulf role in this, I just want to jump in and ask you to kind of comment on this part of it too. Nathan mentioned the financial strife that the Palestinian Authority is dealing with, and there's been a lot of finger pointing about who's responsible for that and the failure of Gulf countries to keep up with pledges and make contributions and so on. But here you have major pledges being made for reconstruction, which is absolutely needed, but directed towards Gaza and specifically for Gaza. So what is that all about?
Well, I think this is definitely one of the.
There you go.
Okay. So I think this is definitely one of the fields where Qatar and Saudi Arabia part ways, for sure, on this policy. And that Qatar, it's easy to be sort of dismissive of Qatar because it's sort of a shallow thing in a way. But I've come to around, and this has taken some coming around, that Qatar is playing a rather deep game in the region, and that they've sort of made a bet that this may succeed. This whole sort of revolutionary era that we're in is going to result in really solid changes on the ground, and I think they've made the choice that they're going to be out in front of that and perhaps and guiding, helping it to some degree, but they're setting themselves to benefit from that, and Hamas obviously plays a real role in this transition and the shift towards an order that is going to be a little bit more Islamic than what we saw in the status quo politics of what we saw before, and I think they're completely comfortable in that. I'm sort of fascinated to see them taking what I see is pretty sizable risks, though, and doing this, and some of the policy that they're doing in Syria towards Iran. I mean, after all, Qatar is a small place. It does have a lot to lose, and it will be really interesting to see sort of how their gamble pays off. On the issue of funding, I mean, I don't think this will be kind of a high priority necessary for Qatar, but obviously Palestine still resonates really strongly within the whole kind of arena that they're playing in, and I think they want to make sure that that's included, and I think it's more of a medium-term developmental shift that they're trying to do, not a really quick kind of transformation. On the money thing, I found this kind of interesting. I just noticed, this is a bit random, but I just saw a fact that Bahrain, in their budget for 2013, has actually cut their budget by 6%, which I thought was a really striking position to take in this era right now, when all of the Gulf states are throwing a lot more money at their citizens. And it made me wonder myself, where's the Saudi money? And it even said in the same article that a lot of these Saudi pledges that had been forthcoming haven't really materialized as much yet. So if Saudi Arabia is not, and I don't know, I haven't drawn all the links yet and done the research to see exactly what's going on, but if it is the case that Saudi Arabia is not, committing their pledges that they've said, or making as huge a commitment in Bahrain, where obviously I think they would have really sizable interest, very immediate interest in making sure that things don't go off the rails, then I kind of wonder where they're going to be putting money elsewhere.
Thank you. Let's open it up now for Q&A, and we'll start in the back here. Right here, Hani. Right here, Dr. Barakat. You can go ahead. Wait for the microphone. تفضل.
I would like Dr. Iskandar. بالعربي. I would like Dr. Iskandar or Dr. Diwan to explain to me the nature of the conflict between Shiites and Sunnis, which shows itself now plainly in the Gulf, in Iraq, in Syria, and even in Palestine.
Thank you for that question. The Sunni-Shia divide. In 30 seconds, go.
I can only speak to this issue as a media phenomenon, more so than anything else. Functionally speaking, I think it's identity politics is a major sort of determinant of regional politics. It's been that way for quite some time, from the sort of the post-colonial era all the way through until the contemporary period. And of course, it's an incredibly advantageous scenario when you're trying to have a role to play in the domestic affairs of other countries. So as Kristin identified, the Saudis, by articulating a clearly Sunni line, of course, depending on interpretation, it can be either extremely conservative or quite sort of open-ended and more freewheeling. But by articulating that sort of coherent position, they can become a significant player on the ground, not just through sort of material support, which of course we know the Saudis have done, as have various other sort of Sunni front players in the region, and both in the case of Syria and elsewhere, arguably even in countries like Egypt, where the political scene has actually been sort of determined. But still, there is a role to play for this kind of identitarian religious politics. And I think to a large extent it was quite alarmist. The real hinge has been Bahrain so far. where sort of a populist uprising that demands political change and greater sort of political participation for a majority outside of sort of a strong sort of discriminatory religious and doctrinal rhetoric ended up backfiring when the state accused it of being a Shia uprising and of course of Iranian participation. But the real answer to Bahrain is actually Kuwait, which is what Kristin identified. So here in Kuwait you've got a far more sort of nebulous protest movement that is not necessarily easily fragmented along those two lines. So I think what we're going through in this period is a convenient moment for religious identitarian politics that will come to fruition and then pass as the fault lines appear to be more and more fictitious. Because at the end of the day, reconstructing, if one could do such a thing, rebuilding Syria will have to, become an inclusive process that involves various parties. Even in the case of Rwanda, there had to be Hutus and Tutsis participating. You simply cannot eliminate the opposition in its entirety. And the same goes with Bahrain. The Shia are not going to go anywhere in Bahrain. It doesn't matter how many Sunnis are nationalized and naturalized in Bahrain to shift the demographics of the country. It's just not going to happen. So I think identitarian politics will come to pass, but this is the moment of cataclysm, the moment of confrontation, and it is just a media enterprise beyond imagination. I mean, pick up any newspaper or watch any television network in the region right now. This is the moment for it. But I think there's a significant resistance to that. And the resistance appears in all the most unlikely locales. Kuwait being one. Even in Egypt, there's sort of almost a disdain at the idea that, okay, the Sufis in Egypt are Shia, and there's Med Shia, there's sort of a Shia expansion in Egyptian politics. I mean, it's perceived with ridicule and is heavily satirized and made fun of, So I think it'll come to pass, but for now, it is literally a battle on the ground, as in the case of Syria. So it is rhetoric matched with a civil war, effectively, and that's what gives it more sort of munition as far as a populist movement. But as things unfold, I think it'll come to pass. I don't think it'll become more entrenched. Sorry, a little long-winded.
Sure. Just to note about, you said that the Shia aren't going anywhere in Bahrain. It's interesting that in this really strong exclusionary period that's going right now, they just pulled the citizenship from 31 activists. So maybe they actually think that they can change the whole thing. They seem to be playing with the demographic balances and the exclusion.
Wouldn't be the first country in the region trying to do that.
No, not at all. But it's smaller population can achieve quite a lot. But I think this is a really important thing, I think, in Saudi's positioning in the region. And I think part of it is really, I don't want to say genuine, but sort of genuine coming out of Iraq. I think that was something where a lot of people in the region, really with kind of the mind view that they had, really did see this as a sort of geostrategic threat. I mean, I may differ on them and what I think about Shia empowerment in Iraq, but there's no question what the people on the ground thought, and in the Saudi government thought about that. And they did see that as just opening the door to Iran. On the other element, though, I mean, it came at an interesting time when Saudi Arabia actually had been trying to deaden a lot of the Sunni Shia politics. You had a lot of this national dialogue going on in the last decade. Even in Bahrain, prior to this uprising, you had a period where the government was trying to kind of co-opt in a way the Shia opposition. And now we just see this really sharp division and reversal in that. And I think there's two things behind that. One is the Iran element of it and the fear of that. And the second is, I think, for Saudi Arabia as well, the sort of integration of the Shia and the kind of conversation that took place in this period when there was a dialogue going on. You had a lot of these heterodox movements that I've been talking about, kind of Muslim Brotherhood-linked movements that have turned a little bit more liberal, definitely opening up and having conversation with the Shia, who at the same time had moved their rhetoric way back from the period of the Iranian Revolution, and we're now talking in a much more rights-based, constitutional-based language. So you had this meeting of the minds. I wouldn't call it a majority by any means, but there were outreach between these different groups and finding some meeting of the mind, even on the ground in Saudi Arabia. So I think in that position, kind of Bahrain coming along and taking this strong stance against Shia. And in fact, having Shia protesters in the east is perfectly fine for Saudi Arabia. I think they're very happy with that, in fact, because it allows them to portray all of the uprisings as some sort of Shia Iranian conspiracy. And in fact, they did that. When you had any sort of protest or something in Riyadh, the term that they used for the protesters was Shia. Even if they weren't Shia, they were Shia. So it allowed them to distance themselves from any of this and to break any sort of mode of coalition that may have been built at that time. So it plays both a role in the regional role and in the domestic politics of the state.
Okay, we'll go right here at the corner first.
I look at it much, much simpler than that. Number one, every country from Tunisia to Egypt, etc., they have their domestic affairs, they have their domestic problems. We understand this. But the subject of this panel is foreign affairs. The foreign affairs for every country, whether it comes from the West, which is United States, etc., or from the Arab world, or from Egypt, etc., the central issue is Israel. You keep Israel, we will support you. You listen Mubarak, you listen Abdin, yes. And that's why things were very bad. Now things changed since the Arab Spring. They don't take orders from America. Don't listen to anybody who says Morsi sent a letter to Paris saying sincerely. This is Arabic tradition. Al-Mukhlis. Al-Mukhlis means sincerely. It doesn't mean anything at all. So the problem here is everyone, Shia, Sunni, Christian, and the best example is Father Shenouda. Father Shenouda made a sin for any Christian in Egypt to go to Jerusalem. And that was prevented the normalization between the Zionist state. Father Shenouda is the one who did that.
Let's get a response from our panel.
Just a minute,
this.
please. Just 1 second only, please. Okay? So the story here is that the only problem that the Palestinian issue is not taking off completely all over the Arab world is unfortunately the Palestinians themselves. As long as this PA is in place, Israel is secure. And therefore nobody will care to give them anything. Once a leader comes and say, oh, Jerusalem, you will find millions and millions of people come to support Palestine, and that Zionist colonization will end.
Let me ask you to if you agree with the assertion that Palestine and Israel and the Palestinian issue is really the central dynamic in the internal changes and the direction that these different states will take forward, or do you disagree?
Short term, I disagree very strongly. Long term, I wouldn't put it in the same terms, but I think the issue will not go away, and it will probably emerge fairly forcefully at some point in the future.
I think I would definitely agree with Nathan's statement. I would agree with what Nathan said, but to an extent, I think that there is a shifting terrain as far as what's going on the ground, as far as the perception of Palestinian self-determination and how it translates into foreign policy. The Americans they sound completely unequivocal on Israel, in the public sphere, but there is, in their sort of building of strong relations with the current Egyptian political scene and the Muslim Brotherhood, who have a very strong agenda for liberation in Palestine. You have to remember that in the run-up to the elections in Egypt, presidential elections, the Muslim Brotherhood top officials campaigning for him everywhere across the country would chant "We're marching to Jerusalem." I mean, this is a critical turning point in the role that the Egyptian political scene can play. Now, and that's precisely why I was trying to cast the incredible sort of contradiction of sending a letter to Netanyahu. I'm not saying that it's a strange dynamic. It is protocol, and yes, the Arabic language is colorful and all of that. We understand this, but given the public sort of uproar that ensued because of the perception of the Muslim Brotherhood and the complete contiguity and coherency of their rhetoric in opposition to Israel, it seems very disheartening for the core. So the Muslim Brotherhood have to be able to respond to all of these different currents. On one level, they have to ensure that the Americans are at bay, okay, at least for the time being, because the Egyptian both political and economic situation is catastrophic right now. But they also have to ensure that their partners don't turn their back on them. They don't want Hamas saying, all right, well, Egypt is not really the main player anymore. Let's turn to the Qataris. I mean, the Qatari emir beat Morsi to Gaza, even though there's a border with Gaza, So the Egyptians have a role to play, and they understand that the end goal is to see Palestine at the forefront of foreign policy in the region. And I think in the long term, they would like to challenge both the Americans and the Israelis, but I think they're buying themselves time. So that's part of the reason why I think Nathan was correct in saying, in the short term, Palestine is not the issue at hand. It's the stabilization of each of the respective nation states. But in the long term, when the Muslim Brotherhood both have the constitutional, tenets to hold them in place, a judiciary that is receptive to them, and international clout that doesn't scandalize them literally on a daily basis, they can begin to move forward towards seeing something on the ground with Palestine. But I think it's in their core doctrine to do otherwise, or to forego the Palestinian cause in the long term would be totally catastrophic for the Muslim Brotherhood, and I can't imagine that they'll win another election solely on this grounds, because they'll seem like a hypocritical organization. And the one thing that keeps their adherents together is the fact that they live up to their word, or they are they're coherent.
I would agree with all that, and I would just note that it's a really strange time in terms of looking at the international alliance on the Palestine issue. I mean, it really wasn't that long ago when we were looking at Syria, Hezbollah, and Hamas being on the front line of these sorts of issues. Now Syria, I mean, we know where Syria is. Hezbollah, I mean, it wasn't that long ago when, if you took a poll, I think Nasrallah was the most popular leader in the entire Arab world. I can't imagine where he would be now. I mean, I can't imagine he would even show up on the list. But I bring them into it, though, just to say that the Palestine issue has a tendency to come up in unexpected ways and in ways that nobody is planning for. So I agree with all of where the Muslim Brotherhood puts it in their thing. But depending on how things go between the United States and Iran, who knows? We may end up having some sort of conflicts. I mean, I'm not predicting this, but you can imagine some scenario where Hezbollah would be coming back into this thing. And I just can't imagine at this transitional period where they're so down how that would play out. But there could be some surprising things that could happen.
Let me just to follow up on this point. Has there been any sense in the messaging of the different opposition movements that are now in government, or have a lot more power now because of these revolutions? Has their messaging on Palestine changed noticeably?
I can't speak for Ennahda, for instance, and I mean, to a large extent, the rhetoric is contained within the instruments, the media instruments that they have at their disposal, and the same thing has happened with the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood only really has sort of dominion over their newspaper, their television network, Muslim 25, and to a far lesser extent on state television. So I don't think their platforms and their means are as extensive as the former regime. So they can't translate their rhetoric to a mass audience with the same level and same scale. But nevertheless, for their own adherents and their own followers and their own constituency, they are still incredibly coherent, and they haven't shifted on their basic principles. But beyond that, I think the real problem here is the contradiction between rhetoric and action. And it has literally been the responsibility of the opposition movements, as incoherent as they may be and disorganized and fragmented, it's been their role to identify the hypocrisy or the sort of the contradictions, the clear and glaring contradictions between rhetoric and action on the ground. But I don't think the rhetoric has really shifted at all. I haven't heard any statements made publicly by the Muslim Brotherhood, for instance, that imply that they have shifted on foreign policy issues such as Palestine or anything else, or their sort of public enmity towards Israel. But nevertheless, on behind closed doors, it's a different process entirely. So the rhetoric still looks about the same to a large extent. And that's, I think, the next phase. I mean, you've only had like 130 days or 140 days of the Morsi presidency in Egypt, and just a few months more in Tunisia. So, only time will tell what will become of this. But so far, they're walking that same sort of same track.
A question here.
The question is, if we are going to see a failure of the Islamic movement facing the challenging test of reality, what is the alternative? The second question, bringing Hamas now to the front, like when they brought Arafat, are we going to see another Oslo under different name?
With regard to the first, I think that's a fantastic question. My sense is that the problems of I'm going to focus on Egypt. The problems of Egypt are so big, and Brotherhood's ambitions were so big. There's going to be some failure no matter what. But the question about alternative is a real one. I'm not sure, and I'm going to talk just in strict electoral terms. Right now, which is what the focus of my talk was, right now I'm not sure there's a good electoral alternative. The most powerful one is the Salafis. So it seems to me that poor policy performance on the part of the Brotherhood may not necessarily result in electrical catastrophe for them. I think they may be there for a while, at least as not necessarily governing by themselves, but governing in coalition. My hunch is if you had an election today, Morsi would win by a much larger margin. So I'm, in spite of the fact that this 100-day program came to such limited results. So I'm not sure that there is a viable alternative yet, and I'm not sure that one is emerging. With regard to Hamas, it's a very interesting way you framed the question, because in a sense that would be a strong Palestinian criticism of Hamas, right? Your middle name is resistance. When have you resisted lately? What is happening to Hamas right now, according to its critics, is that it has abandoned any kind of posing of any alternative, and it instead is just deeply entrenching itself in Gaza. And I'm not sure that Hamas has any more effective response than to say, we're not going to do this forever. Someday things will change. Tomorrow's another day.
I want to, on the issue of Hamas, though, and Gaza and Egypt, this is another thing we started to touch on. I think, Adel, you mentioned that the government has stated that in the next 24, 48 hours it's going to start going after the tunnels. At the same time, we saw this recent movement by Gulf countries and even by the Prime Minister of Turkey saying that he's going to come visit, more of a dedication to kind of support the government in Gaza. Does that suggest that maybe Egypt is going to start moving towards more direct transfer of goods and aids? If the tunnels don't exist as an alternative, what other way is there? And then the other part of that, which I think a number of people are worried about, and Sarah Roy recently gave a fantastic lecture on this issue here, is Gaza drifting away and sort of being pushed into an incorporation with Egypt because it's being closed off in all other directions. So maybe there isn't another Oslo that's coming. Maybe that's the underlying objective here, because that seems to be the direction this is going, a pull towards Egypt and a distancing from the rest of Palestine.
I think you're really sort of tapping into sort of almost a prophetic moment here. It's like, what does this really mean? I can't really read the Egyptian sort of political sort of reaction to the situation in Gaza and the relationship with Gaza.
But bring it up is because the tunnels are the lifeline for Gaza, for the economy, for everything. So if that was in fact to go, I mean,
Well,
what happens
but the
then?
tunnels don't have to be the lifeline for Gaza, because under a Morsi administration, I mean, of course, this was one of the campaign promises, is that the border, I mean, literally, they said the border crossings will be open. I mean, this is what Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood said in all of their campaigns. We will open up the doors to Gaza. Okay. Now, the reality on the ground is changing, largely because there is a perceived security threat inside Sinai from groups that are not clearly articulated. I mean, of course, there are some cases you would read articles that say jihadis, or it would say, well, it's Sinai Bedouins who are disgruntled by their disempowerment for the past 30 years, or sometimes it's a combination of the two, or maybe they're Palestinian militants, or maybe it's Israel who's feeding it. Anyway, it's a completely vague and opaque area, to such an extent that it's justified the Egyptian government to securitize Sinai to such an extent to ensure that no other players will have a role inside that territorial region. And it also means that the Egyptian government, I think, with the exception of a few visits by, like the Emir of Qatar and sort of high-profile figures, I think the Egyptian government under Morsi is going to try and basically shutter in Gaza, do the complete opposite, which is a way to sort of pass the baton back
Not
to
my
Israel.
problem.
Yeah, it's like, yeah, you're not coming here. This is not Gaza. We're not inheriting Gaza. We're not inheriting the problems of Gaza, which is really no different than the Mubarak.
Is that is
Now,
your
of
sense
course, I
that
could
that
be
is
wrong.
because of its implications on the broader Palestinian question, or because Egypt just doesn't want to deal with it?
Both. But don't hold me to it, because again, you never know what'll happen. But I imagine that the reason why it's such a strong stance vis-a-vis trade between Gaza and Egypt, arguably you could have a very, very lucrative trade in Egypt. I mean, keep in mind that the northern Sinai governorate is one of the poorest and one of the most sort of downtrodden of Egyptian governorates. So it can benefit tremendously from trade in this area, both through commodities and what have you. So it's not happening, and there's really no clear justifiable reason why that shouldn't happen. There could be a role to play for the Americans here. I don't know. I can't see behind sort of in the back in the backstage, but I think the Egyptian government has done everything that it claimed it would not do during the electoral period right now vis-a-vis Gaza. And I don't know what it means, but what Sarah Roy sort of identified as a potentiality may be a reasoning for why maybe the foreign ministry in Egypt, the Ministry of Defense, and the Ministry of Interior appear to be completely in concert as far as ensuring that Gaza is intact and there's very little sort of overspill.